Starr Miller was born in Myerstown, Pennsylvania on August 3rd, 1938. Starr Miller was born to Ralph Miller and Grace Miller. Starr Miller worked with his family on their farm for a number of years. In 1956, he graduated high school. Before he graduated, he was working on the farm with his family. He was 18 years old when he enlisted. He enlisted in 1957. He decided he was going to join the Air Force. He thought he was going to be drafted anyway, so he wanted to enlist so he could do what he wanted to do. He was looking forward to flying the planes. The main conflict that he was involved in was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Air Force is a branch of the military where it involves more of the sky than the land. There are more planes and tanks and cannons, or the Air Force could just transport all of the big vehicles to the other countries. Mr. Miller wanted to join the Air Force because he thought it would be cool to fly some of the planes. I wanted to go to the Air Force too and see if I could fly in the planes. His uncle J. Ray Bickle was also in the military. He was a World War II navigator on a B-24 bomber. Mr. Miller was really inspired by him, so that is another reason that Mr. Miller decided to join the military. He was a World War II veteran and flew Navigator B-24. So that's my hero. And he was a big serviceman in World War II, so I thought I'd try and do my part. So later, after he graduated school, he enlisted into the Air Force. He remembers his first day of service very vividly. Oh yes, they're very remembered. Go to boot camp, you don't forget that. When he got off the bus, you could not talk unless you were talked to or asked to talk. Everyone would have to wake up at 4 o'clock every morning and then go out on a 10-mile hike. Sometimes you could get lucky and get a KP and peel potatoes and have lots of fun. Mr. Miller even said that there were many different types of vacations. Mr. Miller even recalled going to the Alamo and having a great time. Everyone had to practice marching and training so they could go on to bivouac. Bivouac is when you camp outside and there are a bunch of different obstacle courses you have to pass. Luckily, Mr. Miller went out when it was warming up and could sleep outside. Mr. Miller said his overall basic training was pretty good. After Mr. Miller was done with his basic training, he headed off to school. He was trying to become an airborne radio operator, so he had to learn all about Morse code. He basically had to learn a new way of communication. This was a send. You could send dots and dashes. Dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, 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 SOS. That was the famous one. Mr. Miller then got sent to SP Air Force Base in Mississippi. He recalled having much more free time and how he could run 1.5 miles around the track. Eventually, Mr. Miller received some good news and bad news. He learned that he passed, but he also learned that they no longer have radio operators on Air Force planes. And Mr. Miller learned that he could not become a radio operator. He asked what else he could do that would still allow him to fly a plane. He found out that he could be a loadmaster. A loadmaster is basically someone who loads the plane. He supervised whatever that would needed to be loaded, so that would include jeeps or guns. They also have to make sure that the plane is not overloaded either. Make sure everything is secured correctly and tied down right, so nothing bad happens. Also, Mr. Miller says that when loading the planes, you have to distribute evenly. Most of the heavy stuff had to be put where the engine was, and most of the lighter stuff just went in the back. Mr. Miller said that pretty much only worked with the C-119 aircraft. Mr. Miller also recalled a certain issue that occurred with one of the planes. They were flying the plane and one of the engines quit and the plane was pretty well loaded up. The plane has 2 engines, but it was a smaller cargo plane, but everyone did a good job and got the plane to start working properly again. The main conflict was the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was when the Russian leader was going to put all kinds of missiles down in Cuba, but luckily our president at the time, Kennedy, had a plan and made sure none of it happened. If the Khrushchev leader would have followed through, that would have easily started a nuclear war. Mr. Miller stated that one of the missiles could probably wipe out New York. So everyone was really scared because that could have been the beginning of a nuclear war. Staying in touch with family was not that difficult for Mr. Miller. He and his family would just send letters back and forth to each other. The only hard time to keep in touch was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. According to Mr. Miller, he actually really enjoyed the food that was supplied. He says how he had tried new things that he had never had before. He says that he still eats some things to this day. Mr. Miller was on active duty for about 6 to 8 months, then he was just in the reserves for about 2 to 3 months. He got in 1957 and out in 1964. After Mr. Miller finished serving, he later moved back to farming. Then he continued on to work at Alloy's Foundry aluminum farm for about 43 years and then retired. He worked at the Mannheim Auto Auction for many years after retiring from the foundry. Now he lives on his farm in Myerstown, PA, and likes to drive cars and play golf. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for your military service.